My name is Ron Blauk, and this is not complicated. In 1986, I read the book Dianetics by L. Ron Hubbard, and it resonated deeply. He explained a few things I didn't understand, then offered what seemed to be a workable technique to undo all the internal bullshit I was carrying that I couldn't seem to unfocus from. I was a highly motivated regular guy who didn't like himself. I came by it honestly. Both my mother and father spent much of their available discussion time with me telling me why I shouldn't like myself. I'm surely not the only one, and given our moderate economic advantages, I always feel stupid telling stories about my difficult childhood, but it sucked, and it caused real damage. Despite 50 legitimate years of self-work, that program is still in there calling out from time to time, forcing me to deal with it. Making it all the more complicated was that half the time my mother told me I was the greatest thing that had ever lived, that I was brilliant and gifted and had talent and was legitimate genius. The whiplash from one to the other created an odd psychology, as you can see from these videos. Dad was absolutely consistent. In the 50 years I got to live with him, he praised me precisely twice. I figured out that he loved me in the mid-90s when my then-wife beat me over the head with it enough times to make me see it. I didn't come to understand that he liked me, which is a very different thing than loving, until after he died and all of his friends told me that all he ever did was tell them stories about my adventures and how much he enjoyed the things I did. Talk about a mind-blowing shock. People are complicated. A year after I read Dianetics, I was in St. Louis and went to a Scientology organization to get some auditing to see how it worked. When I came out of the session, I walked into a room with all the organization employees standing around Hubbard's photograph, applauding and yelling, "Thank you, Ron." I correctly concluded they were insane and never went back. Somewhere in a file drawer in St. Louis is a contract I signed obligating me to the Scientology path for 1 billion years, forever ruining my opportunity to run for President of the United States. The processing techniques in the book stuck with me because they made sense. Once the internet arrived in 1994, I started to research Scientology, confirming my initial read with the applauding employees. They were all crazy. But I happened upon groups of former Scientologists who had left the church and were trying to use the techniques while leaving out the insane parts. It's worth noting that the craziness level with the ex-Scientologists was pretty high, but never approached the true Scientology organization lunacy, something I learned a lot about because I became friends with people who knew Hubbard personally. It's also worth noting that the Scientology practices work, often more deeply than any other techniques I've ever learned or used. There's true power there, and you'll rarely hear that part of the story when the news is discussing Tom and Katie or John Travolta's massage habits. After a year of online exploration, in September of 1995, I flew across the country and found myself sitting in a sunny backyard in Los Altos, California, at the home of one of the men from the online groups who had invited me out for a class. 20 of us sat around for 3 days co-processing each other. It was remarkable. It became my first experience of discovering that internet people were generally like they seemed to be online once you met them. Somewhat unexpected phenomenon that has repeated itself many times since then. Perhaps I have a reality filter that only lets the real people through, but everyone I've ever met in person after meeting them online have been who they appeared to be before we got together. In the afternoon of the last day of the workshop, the guy I was working with asked me one of the canned questions as we were processing something bad that had happened to me when I was 11. I thought for a moment, and then my entire life changed. I've tried to write this story without being specific to keep the video shorter, but it doesn't work. In order to really understand what happened, you have to hear the sequence of events. I was one way before it happened, and I was a different way after. A 180-degree shift that occurred in less than 2 minutes. I completely reversed my then 34-year-long path and turned it in the opposite direction. It wasn't an altered state miracle like those I later had in meditation. It was a realization, a couple thoughts that had never occurred to me previously. For my entire life, during and after the moment the triggering event occurred, I'd been thinking about it in a particular way that then defined everything I did during and after it. continuously replicating the pattern hundreds of thousands or millions of times until that singular moment where I got a glimpse of another way. When I was 11 years old, I sang in a boys' choir at the Episcopal Cathedral in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. I was pretty good. The church was in the heart of the city, 20 minutes from our suburban house. After a Sunday service, I waited for my mother to pick me up. She didn't come for 3 hours. For the last 90 minutes, the choir director sat with me on the back steps of the church. I can still see and feel them, old-style metal grate steps leading down from the choir room door. I was humiliated, horrified, ashamed, miserable, broken, and nearly out of control. Mom being late was normal. That was normal mom drama. But the 3 hours was next level. Then, when she finally got there, she spent the drive home telling me I should be glad she picked me up at all because she was agoraphobic and couldn't go out of the house. I should be proud of her for the fact she overcame her burden and even showed up. That was typical, although it wasn't constant, just a regular life drumbeat playing out a few times a week. For the 23 years after it happened, that event festered like a wound and bound itself to all the prior mom drama and the mom drama that was still to come. I had already disliked my mother, but there was an element of hate after that. I've tried my best to let it go, but she keeps on going after me, and the older I get, the more I'm enjoying nursing it a bit. Being loving never helped, so some legit hatred's fueling my soul. I wish it were different, but it's not. Sitting in the backyard in California on that memorably beautiful day, we were doing a clearing process in which we recounted the event like a story from start to finish. The processor guided me to start at the beginning and tell the tale. It was painful. I might have even cried through it. After a couple of times repeating the event, I suddenly stopped and had the thought as I was envisioning myself on the steps. I could have walked home. That stopped everything. Like a kind of internal jerk. I can still feel the shock. It was 5 miles, including a trip through an entirely black neighborhood that had a couple of murders a week. I was a pasty white, pudgy 11-year-old. The odds were not good I would have survived that walk. My mind tried to get me off the hook. You would have gotten killed. Relief. It was still Mom's fault. No way I could walk through that neighborhood. And then something inside me asserted itself and said, you could have walked home. It was a knowing. The price might have been high to include my life, but I could have gotten up off that porch and just walked my gushy 11-year-old ass back to the house. That thought and the associated knowledge settled all through my body over the next 10 seconds. None of it had ever occurred to me before that instant. 23 years of missing something that entirely obvious, keeping me unknowingly repeating the same pattern, allowing others to control me because there was nothing I could do about it. In that moment, it ended. Pow! No drama, no visions of God, just a singular shift in understanding. If you're a psychology person, my locus of control flipped from completely external to completely internal in a perfectly clean 10-second break a third of the way through my life. There was before, and there was after, and I was not the same. You'd think that would have been a happy moment, and it was, but it was unexpectedly terrifying. Now I had to do something about it. The old way of thinking made me victim to others, and the new way showed me that I'd had choices I didn't know I had in every moment. For 34 years, I'd completely failed to see them. That was embarrassing. Now I was obligated to be in charge and create my life instead of sitting around complaining that I'd been harmed by others. That what others do is what others do, and that there's always an option somewhere. It took about 10 years for that moment to complete itself in my psychology, if something like that's ever complete. It also created a social problem. I can now see how almost everyone is holding themselves hostage to one thing or another without being able to open the channel that's got them stuck. They can't see past the funnel they've built for themselves. Making it all the worse, and this is going to sound crazy, is that most people tell me within a few minutes of meeting them exactly what their unique filter set looks like. I'm never trying to analyze anyone, but my mind sorts it all out behind the scenes quickly, and then I have to deal with knowing. At first, I thought it was all ridiculous. There was no way I was penetrating that quickly. 30 years later, I'm not sure I've ever been incorrect, even with the most unlikely situations and people. I've discovered that telling someone the thing they can't see is not wise. It's devastating. It creates psychological explosions, sometimes near insanity. After a few years of trying to help and discovering I was doing real harm, I stopped doing it. I learned how to keep it to myself and love people as they are for the things that they're worthy of being loved for. That moment in Ed's backyard set the frame for everything that came next. A year later, a Kundalini awakening discussed in episode 2. 9 years later, Samadhi, discussed in episode 1. I wasn't done with my life-changing Scientology adventures, however, and they're to be continued in the next episode. And in the way these things work, as I was writing the script for this story, I took a moment and went back into the original event as if I was there. I consciously revisited it, something I'd likely not done since I was sitting in the backyard 30 years prior. I'd remembered the moment of change with great clarity, but I'd not run the actual event with Mom in the late pickup. And damn if my mind didn't do its magic one more time. As plain as day, I realized I could have walked around the bad neighborhood. It would have made a 7-mile trip a 12-mile trip, but I might have lived instead of having to risk my life to get home. I never saw that option, until I did. Robert Heinlein had an incredible line in one of his books. I've read all 57 of them at least 3 times. He said, "You can't control a free man. The best you can do is kill him." Isn't that the truth? I didn't understand it until that moment of transformative change opened a window that had previously been closed. It's a sentiment worth growing into. But first you have to be free. And I didn't know I wasn't until I was.